Okay, we are a few minutes after, so we're going to get started with the presentation. I'd like to welcome you today. My name is Tyre Holfetz. I am the Wildfire Risk Mitigation Program Manager, and today's webinar will cover the Western State Fire Managers Grants, the Landscape Scale Restoration Grants, and the Hazard Fuel Reduction Grants. Again, if you could please mute yourself so that we can avoid any feedback, that would be very much appreciated. And if you're having difficulty with your bandwidth and you need to be off camera, that is also perfectly fine. If you have questions, we're going to take those through the chat and verbally at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question and you don't want to forget it, please put it in the chat and we'll track it from there. Behind the scenes today is Isabella Pritchard. She is our new grants project coordinator. I'd like to welcome her. And if you haven't had a chance to meet her, please reach out and say hello. She will be the individual that you'll work with if you decide to put in a project proposal in the development of that once it has been vetted through the Idaho Lands Resource Coordination Council. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. Did you want to say hello to anybody or to everybody, Bella?
Hello, everybody.
Any other words of wisdom?
Feel free to reach out with questions, or if you have any sort of hiccup through the process, I am absolutely here to be your resource in walking through this. It's not as challenging as it seems, and together we can absolutely be successful. So please reach out.
She's a phenomenal resource. We're very lucky to have her here with IDL. She was definitely one of those folks that you hope to find, and we found her. So that was pretty awesome. Again, I'm Tyre Holfetz. I am the Wildfire Risk Reduction Program Manager for the state of Idaho. I deal with a lot of things, to include the county wildfire preparedness plans. I support project planning and implementation and administer the programs that we'll be talking about today in this presentation. To begin with, let's talk about the critical resources that you're going to need. Hopefully, you've given some consideration as to what kinds of projects you would endeavor to seek funding for implementation for. Those projects include fire risk mitigation, habitat enhancement, riparian restoration, community forests, projects, and the list goes on. And we'll highlight a few of those further on in the presentation. This is a recorded webinar, so be aware of that. Once we're done with today's presentation, we will do some editing and then post it to the website, after which there are links, as you can see on the associated screen capture of our webpage, the various programs that an entity could seek funding for implementation of your specific project. If you're interested, please sign up for the Gov Delivery subscription so that you can receive notifications on a regular basis on the grant opportunities as they roll out, or those that we become aware of, though we may not specifically administer those, and share that information with that subscriber group as well. So project planning as it relates to the proposal development. What should you have done prior to seeking funding? One is that there should be not just you as an entity interested in implementation of this project. Hopefully you've participated in the county wildfire preparedness plans in their updates on annual basis, or their revisions, which happens every 10 years. And as part of that process, projects are identified that cross boundaries and The intent is to impact the vitality of communities in reducing the risk associated with the vegetation in the environments that communities are found in. There are a couple of things that you should do if you're not aware of your CWPP status is first figure out if the document is up to date. So plans that are greater than 10 years old, unfortunately, cannot be used as referential information or materials for the application to the Western State Fire Managers and Hazard Fuel Reduction grants. For the landscape scale restoration grants, the State Forest Action Plan is the place to find that information. And since I am one of the authors of that document within the Forestry Assistance Organization here at Idaho Department of Lands, I promise you it is up to date and it will be going through a revision this coming year. Finally, you're going to want to ensure that you understand the quantifiable measures associated with the project. So how many acres are going to be treated? How many things are going to be planted? How many community education events? How many signs will there be? So understanding these three elements within your project planning process will help you become successful at the delivery of a successful application while working with Bella and myself. So in the development of projects, we want to make sure that we have SMART objectives. So those are specific, measurable, achievable, reportable, and time-based. So that's your metric to determine whether or not your particular project that you're seeking to obtain funding for will meet the muster mark, per se, of how we will review the applications as both internally and the Idaho Lands Resource Coordination Council. So think of what things you can count and how you're going to do those and when you're going to do those. That's really what that boils down to. How are the hazard fuels projects or education projects related to wildfire addressed? So CWPPs, as I previously mentioned, have to be 10 years of age or younger. If they're greater than 10 years of age, they have essentially expired and therefore cannot be used as the reference material. Many CWPPs in Idaho have begun to be integrated into the hazard mitigation plans. So each county has a hazard mitigation plan that addresses hazards that will be potentially occurring or do regularly occur within the county jurisdictional areas. And wildfire is definitely one that is found in every hazard mitigation plan in the state of Idaho, but not every hazard mitigation plan is also a CWPP. So approximately 25 hazard mitigation plans and CWPPs have been integrated together. And if you're interested in knowing if your county has a plan that meets that criteria or has gone through that integration process, please feel free to reach out to me. As part of the CWPP process, we have the establishment of projects. So what does that project look like in a CWPP? Because the funding sources are requiring us more and more to have more explicit detail associated with our projects identified in our plans than generically we want to implement fuels projects in X place. And here's a good example of a project both in the general sense as well as in the specific sense. And the specific sense is what we want to make sure is included. Now, if your project isn't in the CWPP, don't be too concerned, because updating the CWPP is rather easy. You send an email to the administrative point of contact, which is the emergency managers in most cases in the state of Idaho, and ask them to amend their project list with your specific project. And it's done. So another example on the education front is that we want to provide some level of education, and we want to do that for what purpose? So as you can see the example here, we want to provide fire mitigation utilizing Firewise pamphlets in the particular community of New Meadows, as opposed to we want to educate the populace on fire mitigation. So try and avoid projects that are general in sense and more specific, because it helps in the application process as we talk about what type of endeavor we want to undertake, because it means that it's likely been collaborative. So here's another project about working with specific citizenry on the efforts of a community chipping program. So we want to do community chipping in Nez Perce County. Not so helpful. When we hone it in and we inform that it's going to be for the Lenore community, it gives us a far better idea of what the proposal is supposed to cover, because the project is explicitly listed in a CWPP. All right, let's talk about the funding source and how it comes to IDL. Funds from the program come to IDL from the U.S. Forest Service state and private forestry branch. We appreciate the funding that they provide to us for the implementation of projects throughout the state of Idaho. The Western State Fire Managers and Landscape Scale Restoration grants and the Hazard Fuel Reduction grants in Region 4 are ranked and scored through a competitive process. The Western State Fire Managers and Landscape Scale through the Western 17 states, and the Hazard Fuels Region 4 through those states that are found in that Forest Service region, which are Idaho, Utah, Nevada, and Wyoming. Once IDL is the final applicant, so that means that the funding will come to IDL if awarded, and then will be allocated to a subrecipient or a cooperator like yourselves before the submission process. So this is a point where we need to interject that the applicants need to be governmental entities, fire departments, 501c3s that are fiscally sound, university or education systems. So private citizens need to work with one of those types of entities if you're interested in a particular project for implementation of work in your community. And here we go. I just covered this. My apologies for not clicking on the slide sooner. Additionally, associated with this grants is that each application will be for $240,000. In the templates that you are going to be utilizing, you will notice that there is already information filled out for $60,000 to make these applications $300,000 awards. That is the max total award amount. So for all intents and purposes, every application should be $240,000. If you don't have a $240,000 project, please reach out to Bella or myself and let's talk about your particular project. And we may still seek the full award amount and only sub-award that amount which you need. And we can use the residual dollars to support other projects or a project in a different location. Final thought here is that reimbursements for these programs are how we administer them. So that means that if you're awarded a project, you expend funds, pay for those expenses, and then seek reimbursement through the Idaho Department of Lands for those expenses. So being aware of your financial stability is really important when making consideration of applying for these funds. There are no upfront grant funds, so these are not cash grants, reimbursement basis only. And if you have any questions on that, please capture it in the chat or we'll talk about it at the end. Let's talk a little bit about match and leverage. Match are those things that grant funds would normally pay for, but need to occur because the federal awards require a level of commitment on the part of the participants. The grant instructions indicate that it is a 50-50 for the Western State Fire Managers and for the landscape scale restoration grants. We only pass 10% of that requirement on to you, the local cooperator. So as you're developing your application, be aware that you're only required to show 10%, but we definitely appreciate if you're able to contribute more than that. And that match can come in the variety of forms. It doesn't have to be cash, it can be in kind. Versus leverage. Leverage elements are other federally funded projects or activities that could not be traditionally paid for by grant funds. For example, in the Western State Fire Managers program, we cannot pay for training of firefighters or the enhancement of apparatus by adding like a pump or a tank on a piece of equipment. That could be considered leverage because it could be supporting burning activities as part of the program, but can only be considered leverage. Additionally, our federal partners and their participation in these programs or projects are considered leverage as well. So really what the bottom line is that your landowners and your partnerships are critical for the success of the program, because we want everybody to have ownership in this, not just provide a layout of funds because it's a good opportunity. Let's talk about the timeline for just a moment here. There are 3 stages as shown on the slide. IDL seeks proposals every year, which is the period that we are in right now. We then will work with the Idaho Lands Resource Coordination Council in the selection of 10 applications to move forward for the Western State Fire Managers grants, upwards of 5 applications for the landscape scale restoration program, and for the hazard fuel reduction program, that is an internal discussion. And once we've decided which applications in those various funding opportunities, we will reach back out to those applicants and let them know that they have been chosen. And the remainder we will also inform so that if they would like to continue the development of their application for submission in a future round, they can do so. IDL then will submit the projects to the various competitive review processes. Those processes generally take 3 to 4 months to complete their entire review, and then notification back to the states on the those applications that have reviewed and scored high enough to allocate funding towards. So here, you can see that we opened up the initial opportunity in January. We had our initial webinar the 25th of January, but as you well know, we've rescheduled for today so that we can have a robust discussion. The pre-proposal process will close the 15th of March. We will work with ILRCC, the Idaho Lands Resource Coordination Council, on the proposal reviews in May or June, and then development will occur thereafter. That primary development period will be done in conjunction with Bella. I will help where needed, but primarily you'll be working with Bella, who you're hopefully seeing on the screen there. So for applications that score high enough within that review process, states are generally informed that the application was funded and that those funds will be awarded through an agreement with the Forest Service to the state sometime in the summer. In the last couple of years, it's been late August. Depending on the funding, where it's coming from. So if Congress has a continuing resolution in place, sometimes that can even delay that further. Or if we have a budget in place, then we sometimes receive that notification sooner. The reality is that most applicants are notified sometime in the early fall, late September to early October, that their projects were awarded. And then through the winter, I work with those cooperators to enter into an agreement so that they can begin the implementation of their work during the next project period. So we're talking generally, your application is from time you send your pre-proposal in to boots on the ground doing the work, approximately 2 years' time. Every single application requires, at least in part, reference to the Idaho Forest Action Plan. This plan establishes the goals of the state, Idaho Department of Land specifically, on how we want to address and protect forest and critical landscapes within the state of Idaho. As part of that plan, threats and benefits to forest and critical landscapes are identified, data sources are captured, and evaluations and modeling exercises are completed to help us identify issues and establish priority landscapes or special landscapes within the state of Idaho. Each of these priority landscapes have particular objectives or criteria for the protection or reduction of threats to forests in the state of Idaho. So it's important that you look at the product, this web link here, which is also on the grants webpage, to figure out whether or not your project falls within a priority landscape. If it does not, please reach out to Bella or myself to discuss your project further. Just a quick overview of those priority landscapes. As you can see, basically all the private land in the state of Idaho is covered in some form or fashion by a priority landscape. There are two shared stewardship landscapes, which you can see in red, bold red, one in the north and one in the south. Those are priority landscapes where if we receive applications from cooperators, those particular applications receive preferential review as part of our consideration on full proposal development. The landscape scale restoration grant specifically has a requirement. The Federal Executive Order 13985 was put in place January 20th, 2021. USDA Forest Service shift prioritization of projects that include equity, specifically the inclusion of benefiting historically underserved communities via economics, ecological, or social impacts. So if you're curious to know what that means, the underserved component of the landscape scale restoration grants is that your project has to meet one of those required thresholds. And if it doesn't, then unfortunately, we'll have to consider the project through another funding source. So I mentioned that there are 5 state applications that the landscape scale restoration that IDL is able to submit to the Western process. Also, there are 2 tribal applications that in total make 7 applications. The tribal process is separate from that which I'm presenting today, but we can help shepherd you through that process if your project falls within tribal boundaries. We have to ensure that the projects within the landscape that you're proposing address the protection and enhancement and conservation of landscapes, specifically those that are found within the State Forest Action Plan. All projects that are landscape scale restoration have to include an education, outreach, identification of relevant audience, and how we're going to transfer knowledge of the project to others, meaning, is it replicable? How do we take the practices that are proposed, put them into implementation, and then that be done by some other entity in some other location utilizing the information. There is priority given to landscape scale restoration projects that are cross-boundary in nature, that they are in proximity to other landscape scale National Forest System service lands that have similar projects or other federal lands. They are in coordination with other state projects, that they leverage funds from multiple entities. And again, that they benefit an underserved community. That is a scoring requirement of these applications. So keep that in mind and make sure that you use that tool that's available through CGEST, and we'll have more information about those here in a moment. So what types of projects would one consider applying for? Water quality projects, wildlife projects, demonstration projects that achieve accomplishments in a specific area, such as afforestation or reforestation, community tree planting, strategic outreach associated with a particular ideology that we're trying to create a more robust understanding and implementation of, surveys, prioritization, and treatment control of invasive plants. So these are just a few of the types of projects that we've seen come through IDL and be funded through the competitive program. Some adjoining projects, such as cross-boundary fuels projects, wildfire fuels projects by themselves are better situated for Western State Fire Managers or hazard fuel reduction. So if there is other project elements that you're attempting to address, such as drinking water or air quality standards, then LSR may actually be the type of application you want to complete. Prevention and preparedness projects, such as insect and disease, so addressing forest condition or landscape condition health issues, engaging the public in restoration activities associated with post hazard events such as wildfire or flood and debris. So those restoration activities are riparian in nature, generally speaking, or upland forest planting. It is important that you understand that none of these funds can be used specifically for in-stream activity. So if there's flowing water or bodies of water that you're proposing work to be completed in, you cannot do any work that is within the column of the water or the bed that water lies above. You'll have to seek additional funding sources, but all of the upland environment can be considered a treatable area. So here are a few considerations from the instructions. What is the economic benefits? How are those benefits identified? So are they in tons of produced biomass or reduced hazard? What are the insect and disease issues? So we have to address one of these quantitative measures in the application as well. So whether they be silvicultural or landowner assistance, invasive weeds, one of these has to be the primary objective of the project. Those are national requirements, and if your project does not identify one of these, then the project will be deemed, unfortunately, ineligible during the review process. It won't get that far because we, IDL, will ensure that that information is adequately captured and the narrative represents one of these elements. So a couple of others are forest stewardship plans, water quality, water enhancement, wildlife enhancements, habitat, specifically riparian or uplands. There are some funding restrictions associated with the program. The project must occur in communities with populations less than 50,000. So unfortunately, several of our large population centers will not qualify. Cannot expend funds on federal lands, cannot be used specifically for the traditional sense of research. We can use it for evaluation of information, but not for the collection of data, evaluation of data, and then conclusions associated with that evaluation. Cannot be used for construction, such as roads, bridges, culverts. And again, cannot be used within the channel systems or within lakes or impoundments. So as you're considering your projects, hopefully this gives you a good idea of what types of projects you want to do. There are a couple of pieces of information that you'll see when you pull up the project proposal packet, an acknowledgement form. That acknowledgement form just establishes that you understand the restrictions of the program, that it is a reimbursement basis program, that you are financially stable, and that you have the capability of administering the project that you're applying for. There is a budget development guidance in there to help you establish what types of expenditures would be appropriate for the grant. The manual is included as part of the process, and that's the national manual, and then the Western guidance. If you're trying to pick which piece of information to dive into, please, the Western guidance is the one I would encourage you to expend your energies on. Highlight, re-highlight, and reread that. And then following all of that is the actual proposal form. The proposal form we have made some modifications to. So if you highlight or if you hover over a particular box in the application, you will find some instructions that are directly tied to those found in the Western guidance. But for greater detail, don't rely upon the hyper information that pops up in the window, but please look at the guidance specifically. So your acknowledgement form, and we will ask you to sign it. The project development guidance, the national, and then the proposal form. So these are all as one document in the proposal packet. All right. We're going to jump over to the Western State Fire Managers grants now. IDL has the ability to submit 10 applications under the current program. There are changes year in and year out, and there is discussion by the grant committee that oversees that program at potentially changing that number. We won't know what that is until later this fall. So for all intents and purposes, we will be working to complete 10 applications for submission in that program. The types of projects that are covered under the Western State Fire Managers are fuels mitigation programs, outreach and prevention programs, and planning projects, which include updates to CWPP, assessments of individual structures, and to a lesser extent, monitoring. Who can apply? The county has largely been the participants through the emergency managers or directors within the individual counties, though we have worked with entities from state governments, local city governments, fire departments, 501c3s. So each of these entities must give citation in the pre-proposal to the specific project within the hazard mitigation or CWPP. So don't forget that particular piece of information. What constitutes a fuels reduction project? It is explicitly identified again in the county wildfire preparedness plan. These are fuel breaks. They could be full fuel breaks, meaning the removal of all vegetation, shaded fuel breaks, meaning vegetation is left in order to create shade upon the ground, or they could be green strips, and those are planting projects. Those planting projects should plant material or vegetative types that are drought resistant and highly resistive to drought conditions so that they are less combustible. Forest thinning activities, defensible space around private properties, or watershed protection are a small handful of examples of types of projects. What types of projects constitute an outreach or prevention project? School education events, participation at fairs through booths, presenting at HOA meetings, the development of social media. Billboards is another one that we've also funded in the past. And if you've done any driving in Idaho, you probably saw some media at the gas pumps about fire prevention. CWPP types of projects updates include seeking funding to revamp or update an antiquated CWPP. Most of the time, funding is not needed to do that, as I'm able to support most of that through facilitation and small awards to cooperators if needed. To date, I have not needed to award any funding to address those updates, as we have a pretty standardized process and can get those updates done rather quickly. But those plans can only be, those CWPP seeking funding for updates can only be for CWPPs. Other types of projects, assessments and monitoring of conditions, those fall within the planning realm as well. Ineligible activities are projects that solely and only do individual homeowner defensible space. So the idea of these programs is to protect individual communities, so not individual homeowners. Oh, how do we protect a community? Through the engagement of the activities associated with the implementation of our practices on the ground, whether that be mitigation or education. Cannot maintain previously federally funded projects. So if it's been done in the past and you want to do exactly the same thing again, unfortunately, we cannot do that with these funds. We cannot support preparedness and suppression capacity building activities. So buying hose, training firefighters, establishing communication equipment or repeaters. Can't do small business startups, and we cannot buy GIS software, but we can enter information into established GIS or database systems. In the packet, you will see the acknowledgement form, which is the same that we saw for the Western State or for the landscape scale restoration. We have the budget development guide, which will help you establish what types of expenditures are appropriate to apply for. The Western guidance, and the guidance that is currently posted is from the 23 cycle. The guidance will likely go through a revamp based upon recommendations to the grants, the Western Grants Committee. We anticipate there will be changes to this document. So be aware that there may be information that's asked for in here that is generic, and in the coming year, it may be far more specific, or it may be dropped in its entirety. And then, of course, the application form. I apologize, it's not pulling up, but the proposal form is there as well. So with that, I have opted not to go over each section of the documents that I presented today, because in our 2023 pre-proposal process, we went in depth. We will leave that webinar posted to our website. So if you're curious about additional details associated with the individual boxes of the applications, please note that the applications are posted out there. I also want to back up here for just a moment. The Hazard Fuel Reduction Program, which also falls under a very similar proposal packet to the Western State Fire Managers package, is also on the website. There is one critical criteria associated with that program that you need to be aware of. If you're applying for a grant for the hazard fuel reduction, it must be in conjunction with another federal project area, not a specific treatment unit that the feds are implementing, but it must be directly correlated to that project, meaning it must be within 1.5 miles of that project, has been completed no longer than 3 years ago, is currently in implementation, or is planned to be implemented on the federal side of the management activities within the next 3 years. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions. Please feel free to take yourself off mute if you didn't capture your question in the chat. Bella, were there any chat questions that would be beneficial to discuss?
We do not have any chat questions. I will note there are a couple participants who entered in late because we had an incorrect link on our webpage. I apologize to you folks. If you have any confusion with the presentation, we might have a slide from the beginning that we can pop back to. So please feel free to unmute, raise your hand, enter into the chat, and we can absolutely go over some information.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I started a Firewise community, the east of Hayden Lake Firewise community, and I missed perhaps the part where you're telling us whether we, in order to apply for a grant, do we also have to be a 501c3?
You would need to be a 501c3, yes, in order to apply for the grants. Otherwise, working with the local CWPP administrator, which in your case, Karen, is Kootenai County, you're well aware of them and their efforts. So if you're interested in applying for a project, work with the folks at Kootenai Office of Emergency Management in putting in a grant application.
Okay. Is that still Andrea?
It is.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, this is Jen calling from the Latah Conservation District out of Moscow. Hi, Tyre.
Hi, Jen.
I just had a quick question. We're kind of looking at how large of a size of a project we should be working on. And we're thinking about, just from our recommendation from our partners at IDL in our region, about using the pod for one of the pods that they're working on as the scope. But as we're trying to do some GIS mapping for that, it's feeling like that implementation space might be a little large. And I'm just curious if you had any insight or thoughts on just the scope and size of doing like a Western States application.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jen. For projects, generally speaking, that we fund through these programs, you're going to be able to implement somewhere between 150 and 300 acres of actual work on the ground. Now, that project area that you work in should allow you enough latitude to be able to deploy the project activities on the ground without having to seek, if awarded, modifications to the agreement. So generally, the project areas that I put into the agreements are 100,000 acres in size. Mind you, you're only going to do between 150 and 300 acres of work. So that should provide a cooperator like yourselves enough latitude to decide where to do the work, with this idea of reducing the risk to a community So consolidating that work instead of doing a little here and a little there and a little there and a little there for this patchwork effort, that we want to have as much contiguous work as we can possibly put under agreement with adjoining landowners. Now, you mentioned a product called POD. So that's, for those who are not familiar with that, pre-operation delineations. So those are modeling products associated with an exercise that the Forest Service undertook last year. And what those lines represent are places where we understand that fire can, without any influence from human intervention, will likely stop. So at one of those pod lines. Now, that don't necessarily mean that it's going to stop at the first pod, but maybe the second or even third pod line. So these are just our general areas of understanding, and utilizing that as a framework, I think, is a really good place to springboard from, because there's been lots of discussion, lots of conversations, and issues identified with pods and their strength on whether or not they could do what we want them to do, and the citizenry and the landscapes within those boundaries on what can be done to reduce the risk to those as well. So does that answer your question, Jen?
It does. I might have one small follow-up. So just in trying to start to evaluate kind of the mileage or acreage, I guess, and in our case, mileage, because we're kind of trying to do it based around county roads and adjacent home sites within that identified area. Would you recommend, if it seems like it's larger than maybe what this one funding cycle could do, we are kind of thinking about applying and then saying that this is like phase one and that we anticipate these other phases that we're going to work towards, just because it seems like with such a large scope that this is just like the initial bite, the low-hanging fruit, and that there would be opportunities to expand on that in future years.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jen. Generally speaking, the program funding that is available, $240,000, frankly, doesn't go that far. So the idea of phasing out projects until we get them to a point where we feel like they are self-sustaining, or the amount of energy that we need to expend in order to complete the remaining project doesn't return as much benefit. Yes, phasing is definitely the way to go. I've got some projects that I've been working on, and we're in phase 7 of this application process. So it's perfectly appropriate to do.
Thank you.
No problem. I see in the chat we have a question or a request from Jamie. Thank you. And she says, can you speak briefly on the kinds of regulatory triggers this funding may come with? Cultural resources, prevailing wages, endangered species. There aren't any. It's really that simple. So if funding is received, then we go to work. Let's see, from McManus, he says, have you used NRCS equip projects as leverage, and how might they fit into project proposals? To date, we have not used the NRCS equip as leverage elements of these projects. For the LSR program specifically is where that equip is more probable to come into play, because there's likely already been some level of activity on adjoining landowners or planned activities with landowners within the larger project area that could be leveraged associated with that. Oftentimes, though, we're implementing fire mitigation projects in areas that have not had a high participation interest in fuels mitigation activities, specifically through the NRCS programs. It doesn't mean that we couldn't use it as leverage if that information is known and we can give good citation to it, then absolutely, because one of the boxes within the Western State Fire Manager speaks to the landscape. And if we know that NRCS activities have been implemented specifically for fuels mitigation activities, then that will help strengthen that particular box, showing that there's work being implemented and we're tying to that work or complementing that work in landscapes. We have, did that answer your question, Mike?
Yeah, if you can hear me, that worked great.
All right, perfect, thank you. All right, we have another question in the chat, and forgive me, I will slaughter your name if I say it, so I'm just going to go with the question, and it says, does the scope of work always have to be bid out to the lowest bidder, or is it possible to use an MOU agreement with these projects, specifically if the project isn't on private land but county roads? So the cooperator is bound by their procurement processes. We pass along the state procurement processes as part of the agreements that we enter into. And in Idaho, we are able to use best value, not necessarily lowest bidder, but that process looks slightly different than a low bidder competition. So no, you're not required under state statutes to use lowest bidder, but potentially under the procurement policies of the organization that we enter into may dictate that the lowest bidder has to be used. Does that answer the question? Or do you have further clarification? All right.
Can I maybe ask, this is Jen again, one follow-up question to Mike's.
Yes.
Can you maybe help clarify from IDL's perspective the difference between match funds and leverage, and then maybe give some examples of where you have worked with folks and what their match funding comes from?
Sure. The match funds are considered activities or expenditures that would normally be paid for by grant funding. So under the authorities of the grant, where that comes from and how it's awarded to Idaho Department of Lands, those stipulations follow all the way through to the cooperator. So for all of these funding sources, we can't construct things. So that would not be considered a match item. That would be considered a leverage item, like a bridge or correcting the prism of a road or the installment of a culvert, the installment of a water system, the movement of power services underground. So those are non-eligible activities and would be considered leverage, not match. Match activities would be such things as educational outreach efforts. So if a landowner participates in a meeting and you capture them as a participant at that meeting, that time, that in-kind or soft match qualifies as match against the grant, or any activities that a landowner would do to mitigate the vegetation around their own property. So cutting limbs, participating in chipping programs, collecting firewood. So those all too could be considered soft or in-kind match. If they paid somebody to do that, that hard match could be considered as well. The cooperator, in their efforts to deliver the program, if they decide that they don't need any administrative dollars, the individual who's administering the program on our cooperator's behalf, all of their time could be considered match. And that falls within the hard cash match because there's an actual expenditure that's being made, i.e. their time for services. Travel to meetings is often captured as match at a certain mileage rate. So hopefully these examples help answer that question. Did you have something specific that you would like me to talk to, Jen?
I guess I was just going to ask something kind of specific to what Mike mentioned about NRCS equip. I think we have a bit of a unique situation where we have quite a few landowners that are currently in the last handful of years signing up and doing forest steward management plans with EQIP, and then they're doing some implementation. So for example, we have a landowner that, let's say, spent $10,000 doing mitigation work. She got 40% cost share. Could we count the other 60% of the work that she did on her property, if it's within our scope of work, as part of the match, if it's within a certain time frame?
No, we could not. So you can't use, because under the OMB, so the Office of Management Budget, super circular policies, that's actually considered match against that program. So no, we could not. That's an existing or standing program that requires landowner buy-in, even though it's called cost share, it's actually under the OMB interpretations match for that particular program, and we can't double dip into that match. And the match has to occur during the operational period of the agreement. So meaning when it's fully executed to when it's closed out. Otherwise, it's considered leverage.
Okay, so you don't need the match up front when we're applying at this point. We can say what we think the match is going to be as far as like meetings, plannings, workshops that we're going to have in the community where there would be participants. And then I guess on that same note, if we've been meeting for the last year as a partnership to come to the table, would meetings preliminarily be considered match for
No,
partners? Okay.
no. So the preliminary meetings are not matched. They're considered leverage.
Okay.
And the dollars associated with them for these applications don't need to be listed out in that leverage sense, just that there's a collaborative effort to coordinate and create an efficiency of effort, right, is really what you're talking about. And as far as the match pre-application, definitively not. We only want to talk about match that will be developed during the actual implementation of the particular project activities.
Okay, perfect. And then does IDL have a volunteer labor cost that they associate or use, or is it like federally identified what that number is?
We use the national in-kind labor rate.
Okay.
And I believe it's a little over $32 right now, an hour.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Great question. Is there a specific form if a soft match will be conducted? We provide, as part of an award package, a tracking document for this very purpose that you're welcome to use, or you can develop your own. Really, all that's required is that a specific landowner who's submitting their soft match for the match of the grant needs to have their name, the activity that they did, what amount of time that they expended on that, and then some sort of signature associated with it. Electronic signature, if they send it from their email, we consider that signed as well, but just something that says that they validate that the things that they're attesting to are the things that they did. Does that answer the question? Send Isabella or myself an email and we can share that with you. Other questions? It's a lot of information to try and navigate through, so we'll hang out here for a bit. For those who participated in our January 25th brief discussion, were there any topics from that discussion that you would like to see rehashed in this presentation? Well, as folks look to rejoin their normal workday, if you have any follow-up questions from the presentation, please feel free to reach out to Bella or myself at your convenience. Keep in mind that March 15th is going to come a lot faster than any of us really want it to. So put your pen to paper and your thoughts captured and send us a pre-proposal because we'd love to see that. Thanks, everybody, for your time, and we look forward to working with you. Have a great day. Bella, I'll let you end the meeting on your side so the recording captures for you.